On the 10th of May 1940, Germany attacked the Netherlands and the Netherlands was forced to surrender. The reason? Well, Germany had completely flattened the city of Rotterdam, which is our most famous harbor port, and it was also threatening to do that to other Dutch cities, so we didn't really have a choice. After heavy fighting for several days, there was nothing left to do besides surrendering. Eventually the Netherlands was liberated, but not everything went according to plan. Well, at least not to our Dutch plan. It went perfectly well for loads and loads of Allied soldiers who plundered their way around the country to most likely bring it home. The Allies also looted in Belgium, France and Germany. However, the Netherlands was plundered the most of the entirety of Western Europe during the Second World War. And especially the villages and towns around Nijmegen, in the Betuwe region, in the North of Limburg and in the east of the province of Noord Brabant. Imagine the shock that people had when they discovered that their houses were completely empty, all your possessions that you ever had were gone by the people that were supposed to be the good guys. The Allied looters were generally not punished at all. But before we get to the bottom of this entire fiasco, you need a refresher on how the liberation of the Netherlands went, in a very short summary. So the liberation of the Netherlands started in the southern parts of the Limburg province in the middle of September 1944. The Limburg province is the south of the Netherlands. Maastricht is the very first big Dutch city that is liberated on the 15th of September. On the 17th of September 1944, Operation Market Garden started, where the Polish, English, Canadian and American troops tried to conquer the bridges over the big rivers. And at the same time, the plan was to have ground troops come from the south to help with the conquering of those new areas. Unfortunately, the Battle of Arnhem was lost, and when autumn arrived, a very big part of the Netherlands was not liberated just yet. And that was a problem, because the cold was coming away. And the Germans didn't really like the fact that the Allies had now conquered the south of the Netherlands. After the liberation of the south, it was impossible to get coal from the mines in Limburg to the other parts of the Netherlands that were still occupied. There was also a several week-long strike of the Dutch railways, which was announced on the 17th of September 1944 by the Dutch government who governed from London. The Germans retaliated by almost completely stopping the transport of food throughout the west of the Netherlands, mostly Zuid-Holland, Noord-Holland and Utrecht. This led to an enormous food shortage in the big cities in the west of the Netherlands. And a lot of people from cities had to walk to the countryside in order to get some food. In the countryside there was enough food for the entire country, but if you do not have any way to transport it, what can you do? You know, people will starve. Which is exactly what happened. Around 20,000 people died from the famine. We call it the Hongerwinter or Hungry Winter. You will understand why. Now, then it's February 1945 and something is finally happening. The Canadians and Americans liberate the German Rhineland and the northeast of Limburg. On the 28th of March, the liberation of the north of the Netherlands begins and Canadian and Polish troops liberate Gelderland, Overijssel, Drenthe, Friesland and Groningen are also liberated, minus all the islands in the north. Those were the last ones to be liberated, but that's a different story. And the west of the Netherlands is still under Nazi occupation, and it's impossible for the Allies to continue to liberate the Netherlands because of the massive chance of civilian victims and heavy fighting. So the west was still suffering and people were dying, because, you know, famine. Eventually, the Germans allowed bombers from England to drop aid and food above the occupied areas from the 29th of April 1945. Remember when I said that the railway strike started on the 17th of September 1944? Yeah, heavier too late. And then from the 2nd of May 1945, food was finally transported by boat to the Netherlands. But yeah, by that time, more than 20,000 people had died. And on the 4th of May, the German troops surrendered in northwestern Europe. We had English, Americans, Polish, Canadians, Belgians and French soldiers fighting with us as the Allied forces, together with the Dutch Princess Irene Brigade and the Binnenlandse Strijdkrachten, or the illegal Dutch army that came forward out of the armed resistance organizations during the last phase of the Nazi occupation. However, the German commander in the Netherlands, General Blaskowitz, he said that he didn't think the capitulation also counts for the German troops in the west of the Netherlands. It only counted, according to him, for the liberated areas. So on the 5th of May, there were again talks about the capitulation in the town of Wageningen, which included Prince Bernhard, who was the commander of the Binnenlandse Strijdkrachten at that time. There were still people fighting back and forth every now and then. And finally, on the 6th of May 1945, Blaskowitz also signed the capitulation and full surrender of the German troops in the Netherlands in the entirety of the Netherlands. Now, we were and are still very thankful for the Allies for liberating our country. However, they also did a lot of horrible things, including looting. And for this video, I'm talking about Canadian, British and American soldiers that looted the Netherlands. But I haven't seen any sources stating those things that are done by Polish or, other troops. If you have that information, please share it with us in the comments. But yeah. Those who looted the most were the Americans, then the Canadians, and lastly the British. So for a long time, no one actually spoke about the horrible things that the Allied forces did in the Netherlands because they were our liberators. And it was deemed as ungrateful to talk about that when they freed your country of the Nazi occupation. Luckily, the sentiment has changed. And a lot of research has been done when it comes to the looting of the entire towns and cities wherever the Allies went. The Allies were meant to be our liberators, not our occupiers. So, the good guys. And unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. So we're diving deeper into the subject. What happened, what led to these soldiers looting, to the responses of the people in charge of the Allied forces, and so on. Now, war and looting go hand in hand. In the Netherlands, looting happened from both the German side as well as from the Allies, and in this case, the Americans, British and Canadians. They took everything from the houses to factories to hotels to banks to monasteries to churches to hospitals, mostly in the north of Noord Brabant, North of Limburg and especially in the Gelderland province. But when did all of this start? It was the 17th of September 1944 and Operation Market Garden was in full swing. Droppings with many Allied parachutists were happening all around Nijmegen. However, it didn't go according to plan and the entire area continued to be a front line until February 1945. The German army was too strong, they couldn't push through. So what happened between September 1944 and February 1945? Hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers were in the area, waiting for something to happen so they could break through the front line of the Germans. Looting takes time, they had enough time. In fact, they had almost half a year. In the meantime, everyone who lived in the area was evacuated. Most of the looting took place in areas where the civilians were evacuated near the front line, and no civilians were allowed to enter those areas. No one has ever been prosecuted for looting during the Second World War, during the liberation in the Netherlands. So what did they loot and what did they destroy? Everything they could. From entire households and valuable possessions of civilians to looting complete factories empty. For instance, in Nijmegen, an entire warehouse with a big stock of alcohol was looted by American soldiers. After the first time the warehouse was plundered, the owner bricked his warehouse, shut. Didn't help. The soldiers came back and broke down the freshly done brick to take all the alcohol into their army trucks and went off. A police report of that time says these American soldiers stole 11,000 bottles of French wine, 225 bottles of port, 142 bottles of champagne, and 77 bottles of cognac. The total cost 80,000 guilders at that time, which is 540,000 euros today. So what did he get back after the war? 10,000 guilders, missing 70,000. Allied soldiers blew up safes in many towns and cities. There was a meeting in Nijmegen and 17 mayors were also there, of which 8 of them reported that the Allied soldiers had run off with a municipal safe. They also stated that they were disgusted to see so much destruction caused by the men who were supposed to be our saviors. An owner of an ice cream shop found his shop completely destroyed after some visits from Allied soldiers. The motors of the cooling machines had disappeared, all the furniture was outside on a pile, destroyed. Local hospitals lost bedding, furniture, paintings, all were also destroyed and thrown out onto the streets. It almost looked like it was impossible to differentiate between occupied and liberated areas. There were also instances which involved several locations that had patients and a lack of beds and beddings. The Germans came, they left beds and beddings for them, but when the Allied troops arrived, they took it all. They would also loot farms, kill cows and only take out the steak parts of the cow, leaving the rest rotting behind. They would dress up goats to shoot at for fun. The horrible stories are endless, basically. So why were these Allied soldiers looting during the Second World War, and what happened to the looted objects? Now, looting has always been forbidden in war, but in reality it's generally not always enforced because it's difficult during chaos and everything. And when the Allied forces advanced stalled because the Germans were resisting and stronger than the Allies thought, it made the front line very busy. Generally, all civilians from that area were evacuated, and entire villages were empty of civilians, essentially giving the military free rein. Local authorities weren't exactly functioning, obviously, during that time, and soldiers looked death into their eyes several times. And the prospect of being injured or killed in fighting the war is also said to have led to indifference among young soldiers, and soon morality was nowhere to be found. So when they were stuck Without being able to do something, they began looting, mainly because there was no one there to enforce the rules. The chance to get caught was also very low, meaning the chance to get punished is also very low. According to local researchers and historians, we can distinguish between several motives as to why these Allied forces started looting. 1. Looting out of necessity. They were looking for items that they could use for warfare and survival, stealing livestock for when supplies would stop, doors, frames and wooden floorboards to reinforce trenches, and so on. 2. Hunting for souvenirs. Here the soldiers were looking for anything inside all of the homes they visited to grab stuff to take home as a souvenir and memory for their military services. Everything from paintings that hung in people's houses to figurines to other decorations, rugs, tableware and beyond. 3. To gain wealth. This happened a lot. Now, how do we know? Well, a lot of civilians actually buried their valuables or put it behind brick walls or something like that. And they did that obviously before they evacuated. But the soldiers found all of those pricey items very fast. You might wonder, how? When it's hidden? Well, they used their mine detectors as metal detectors to detect hidden valuables. A part of the looted items were sold within the region to other soldiers or to very few wealthy Dutchmen who took advantage of the situation. Army trucks were turned into black markets, and another big part of the loot was packaged into big boxes and shipped to the US and Canada and to the UK, and these soldiers could easily do this because there was a constant flow of goods to and from the front line, as the area was overloaded with military equipment. 4. Boredom. Pure boredom. They would often be drinking and looting at the same time, and there was no one who pulled them back or gave them any repercussions. The army command didn't have time to deal with these men, turn a blind eye. It was entertainment for many. Sometimes there were threats of penalties, but that rarely ever happened. And the final one, they were young men far away from home that had seen too many horrible things and deaths that normal norms and values disappeared. People say that's also the reason why a lot of alcohol was stolen, as a way to escape the harsh reality of war. Now, was the looting ever reported? Oh boy, it was. Oh, it was. A lot. And there are going to be so many examples here, so bear with me. General Hendrik Kruls, he was at the head of the army command at the time, and they were tasked with temporarily being the Dutch authority in the newly liberated areas in the Netherlands until the Dutch government had come back. That meant everything from making sure healthcare functions to the distribution of food throughout the Netherlands and so on. Hendrik Kruls was therefore also the person who got the complaints of mayors from the looted areas and letters from other people and so on. First stories came to Kruls in November 1944, but the looting started earlier, as we have reports and letters that date back to October. When Operation Market Garden failed, the looting quickly started in the Dutch city of Venlo and soon in North of Limburg, east of Noord Brabant and Gelderland, who were being looted. However, it takes a while before things arrive at the highest command in charge, so our beloved Kruls asked questions about the matter to the headquarters of the Allied troops. What answer did he get back, do you think? I'll leave you guessing for a little bit. Well, he got an answer from General in Charge, Louis, from Brussels, and he said that there's always a few bad apples in every army. That doesn't mean anything, and that the army commanders had actually succeeded in keeping the looting to a minimum. I think that's cute, because I don't even want to know what the maximum for looting is, apparently, if this is your minimum. According to General Louis, civilians complained for one reason only. They wanted to get compensation for the damage that the German occupiers had caused in the years of the occupation. They wanted to get some money out of the hands of the Allies, and people were taking advantage of the situation, according to him. And there were also some bad Dutch civilians that were looting items from their neighbors. Now, obviously, they didn't get any further with General Louis. One of the things that Kruls was afraid of was the fact that the Dutch population would turn against the Allies, as Dutch civilians from the looted areas were already making comparisons between the Germans and the Allied forces, where the Germans were thought of as better in this regard. Kruls asked the headquarters of the Allied forces many times to be stricter and control their troops. Didn't help. They told Kruls that he needs to make detailed reports about individuals or units that are looting. As you can imagine, that was very difficult in an area where there's no surveillance and a lot of confusion about the authority in the front. It was not even clear at that time what power the Dutch police had, and that also made Allied troops show little respect for them. But there was also another general from the Allies named Hayes, and he thought it would be good to see the area with his own eyes. He reported back to Kruls and Minister of War Van Lith de Jeude, and Hayes was shocked by what he had seen in the town of Hoogbeek near Nijmegen. full-on army trucks and cars filled with silver cutlery, antiques, pottery, linens, and so on. All of the safes in every building were blown up with things like dynamite, even those inside churches. He saw that soldiers took the steel filing cabinets from the municipality building of Groesbeek, and they had thrown all the administration of the cabinets onto the street, and the entire municipal administration had been lost. Krulls and Van Lith de Jeude already knew they weren't lying, obviously, and that it was truly a horrible scene, but it was nice that someone from the Allies also saw it for what it really was. Nevertheless, the complaints of looting kept on pouring in, nothing was really done, so Krulls also asked his own assistant, Major Pierson, to make a report, especially about the Betuwe region. In February 1945, he wrote, "All houses are broken into and turned upside down and often entirely cleared from top to bottom." According to him, it was impossible that Dutch civilians did it because all of the villages he visited for this report were found inside the military zone, where no civilian was allowed to enter unless they had permission, and then they would need to be accompanied by them. And he had also seen the houses of civilians in this area when they had evacuated, and they were left in good shape. Pierson also reported about the shock he faced when he saw how the Allied forces caused so much unnecessary deconstruction to the houses. He said the following: "Furniture is smashed, all cabinets and drawers are broken open, and the contents are spread, soiled, doors and windows left open, so everything is exposed to the elements." He was also outraged by the fact that the soldiers did street fighting exercises in intact houses, but they also could have done that in the streets and houses that were actually already destroyed by the violence of war. He also witnessed that soldiers set 5 farms in good condition with large stocks of wheat and animal feed on fire with flamethrowers with an exercise. And only when he protested to the officer in question, they stopped the exercise, which was obviously too late. He especially noted how the state of the American army was a disaster for the Dutch population in the region. In February 1945, Krulls wrote again to the Minister of War, where he stated that the ongoing looting made the relations with the Allies poor. Krulls was trying to save not just the relations between the Dutch and the Allies, but also houses, factories, churches, hospitals, monasteries, everything he could. Historians don't think there was a clear response, as a new letter was sent to the new Minister of War, De Boy. And there, Krulls wrote again about the looting of the Allies. A few weeks later, he even said that they needed to bring up the subject to Churchill. People also don't think that Churchill actually did something, as the looting stopped after the end of March 1945, right when the Allies were on their way to liberate the north of the Netherlands and later the west. Another report was made in October 1944 by Reserve Lieutenant T.P. Roosburg of the military authority after he returned from a work visit from the municipalities of Els, Bemmel, Heteren, Dodewaard, Hemme and Valburg. He reports all evacuated houses have been turned upside down, destroyed, and almost all things are stolen from inside the house. More than 40 safes were blown open and they stole hundreds of thousands of guilders, linens, beddings, clothes, blankets, jewelry, and so on. Every house is destroyed. There were torn photos, clothes, pottery was smashed, and many times the floor, table, or even the Dutch flag was used as a toilet. It's without a doubt that at least 95% of this looting is done by Allied forces. Other reports were made by Lieutenant Colonel Suyle on behalf of the Dutch Army Command. He made a report that would eventually end up at the office of Eisenhower. And Eisenhower, well, he unsurprisingly let his people do their own research about the matter and concluded that Suyle was seriously exaggerating. Obviously, Lieutenant Colonel Suyle, he knew he was not exaggerating. Nothing was done. Unfortunately, people think that Eisenhower thought that it didn't matter and that there were more important things going on. Eisenhower also said that there was no proof that this was done by American soldiers. The soldiers, according to him, blamed it on the Dutch civilians who were said to want money. Now, obviously, this was very frustrating to not only the Dutch Army Command, but also to the mayors and the civilians who lost everything. Also because everyone knew who it was. Only after the end of the Second World War, the commanders-in-chief of the Allies would admit that the forces didn't loot anywhere else as much as it did in the surroundings of Nijmegen. Reports were also made by the mayor of the town of Gennep in the province of Limburg, named Jan van Banning. On the 21st of February 1945, he wrote to the Minister of War in London about the looting and heavy destruction which was left behind by what were supposed to be our liberators. He wrote the following: "If it had been an incident, then I wouldn't have dared to draw attention to the matter under these difficult circumstances. However, with the looting and destruction, a new disaster has happened to the already severely affected population. He had also heard of many other horrible stories from mayors in his surroundings that were very similar to those that his citizens went through. He also wrote about safes that were broken open, antiques that were stolen from houses, paintings that were cut out of their frames, and so on. Another story comes from Military Commissioner Blauw, who was responsible for the newly liberated area. He says that when the population returned to Groesbeek, the civilians found their houses completely empty and destroyed by the looting. More than 1,000 houses were looted. There were many complaints to police from villages like Beuningen and Malden, where the population was complaining about the sale of stolen goods to civilians by soldiers, cattle theft and home invasions. It was so bad that Blauw was worried that it would create an anti-English sentiment. So he traveled to London to report this matter to the military top of the Allied forces, and at that time, the Dutch military authority was under American and British authority. So there was some shame around it that the Dutch had to talk to their liberators, about their abuse. It was a sensitive matter. So the looting of the Allied forces was reported, very often in fact, as you now know. In the municipality of Nijmegen in the province of Gelderland alone, there were 1,700 reports of looting and destruction. Some houses and companies were completely stripped or even fully destroyed. So a lot of looting happened. What happened after it was reported? Generally speaking, not that much. Like I said, the American, Canadian, British didn't really want to deal with it. The National Archive in Den Haag has a lot of letters and reports that were sent to the Ministry of War and Ministry of Defense during the war about the matter that are filled with anger and disbelief. Of Dutch people being happy about occupation ending only to come home to it not being your home anymore, to your home being empty, destroyed, torn down. The Dutch government couldn't do much during that time, and after the war it was chaos. Besides that, people that weren't from the south of the Netherlands generally didn't really know about the matter, because it was not published anywhere, only later. Later, some local history clubs wrote a little bit about it, but without stating who the perpetrators were. There was even a commission that did research on the 5 years of occupation in the Netherlands, calling witnesses and publishing books. But nothing was written about the looting, even though there were many letters about the looting sent by General Hendrik Krulls to ministers of war. It was important that there was documentation of the looting and that, for instance, mayors complained to the temporary Dutch authority. The Dutch citizens hoped for compensation, obviously, from the Allies, because it was their doing. They created this mess. Now, compensation is not really what happened, unfortunately, not surprising. There was a small contribution from the Americans, and the Dutch government was eventually able to give some small compensations to some people after going over inventory lists from Dutch citizens. However, the compensation was nowhere near enough. Remember the story about alcohol that was stolen? It was 80,000 guilders, he got 10,000. That was very common and many didn't get anything at all. It also didn't help that it was complete chaos after the liberation. Many civil services were functioning poorly, making it hard for citizens to get through the bureaucratic mess. Now in here there are some stories of people. Here's a story of a family from Groesbeek. The family Jansen were evacuated and they were from the town of Groesbeek, which is around 10 kilometers away from Nijmegen. They were able to return to their house after the official liberation of the Netherlands on the 5th of May 1945. And what they found was bizarre. Their entire house was stripped. Nothing was left behind. All the possessions were gone, with the exception of one semolina dessert porcelain pot, which was filled with feces. Here's another story from Groesbeek about a house called Villa Vogelsang. Many people lived there of family. One of the people who lived there was Petronella Dozy, nicknamed Nell. She wrote in a diary everything about her life in the villa. And on the 1st of October 1944, Groesbeek got the evacuation order from the mayor van Grotehuis, and the Dozy family ended up in the picturesque town of Ravenstein, around 25 kilometers down south from Groesbeek. The first thought of the Dozy family was that the evacuation would only last for a short time. They quickly realized that wasn't the case. The villa was quickly seized by the Americans to turn it into a headquarters, and the family left on the 2nd of October 1944. On the 13th of November, the niece of Nel, that also lived in the villa, named Ineke Halberstad, finally got permission to go to their house and grab some possessions. With around 20 people from Groesbeek, that were all in Ravenstein, they cycled from Ravenstein to the Groesbeekse Weg in Nijmegen. From there they were put into trucks and accompanied by Allied soldiers, and then they were brought to Groesbeek. And every person went with one soldier to their own home. Now the first thing Ineke saw at the house were shut up trees on the driveway. What followed was the house with broken windows and open shutters, making the rain enter the house. It got worse inside. All furniture was thrown everywhere and broken, and so were clothes. There was a small safe that was opened. All mattresses and chairs were gone, all tableware was broken, the entire wine collection in the cellar was gone, and Ineke only got 5 minutes to grab some possessions that were still intact and important to her. At the end of March, Nell got permission to go to the house under the supervision of a soldier. When she saw the house, there was no debris or mess around the house. Commander Mayor Walker walked her around the house, and while the mess was gone, so was everything else. Everything was gone. In her room, everything had disappeared except for the mirror and the piano, but the ivory keys were also stolen. And when Nell went on her way back, she noticed that the supervising soldier was most definitely ashamed of this side of the so-called heroes that she had just seen. There's another story of Mrs. Wolfswinkel Herkens, who lived in Berg en Dal, and on the 4th of October 1944 she visited her neighbors for a short while, and when she returned there were 2 American soldiers upstairs in the house. She originally assumed they were there to check for spies or German soldiers. However, after they had left, she noticed that jewelry from the drawers of her dressing table were suddenly gone. And here's a story of a priest from the village of Mook, and it was the British this time. They took 850 wine bottles from the 1,000 he had in the cellar under his rectory. The sacrificial block in the church had been cut from the wall and was gone. He wrote on the 6th of October 1944 that English soldiers were trying to steal the last things that the population had left. The population already suffered heavily when heavy fighting took place in Mook on the 20th of September, and now it seemed like the village was completely taken from the citizens and transferred to the English. He wrote, "The Americans shot my house into pieces, that was military necessity. The Germans set my house on fire, that was to be expected of them, but the English robbed me of the last pieces that I owned." He said that it wasn't too bad for him because he was still able to work, in his rectory and everything without wine and stuff, and especially compared to other people in the town who have had a sober life already. Imagine returning after the liberation, finding out that all of their last possessions were stolen by the so-called liberators. They were immediately thrown into poverty. Here's another story from a family in Gennep, where a returned family was denied access to their home by the British. They had taken it. The father of the family decided to camp in the barn opposite from the house until the soldiers had left. That took another 6 weeks. How did these soldiers leave, you ask? Well, with a truck filled with basically their entire house. Nothing was left. Piano went in, cutlery went in, everything went in. Floors were broken, doors were ripped out, and so on. And here's another story of British soldiers in Gennep. Mayor van Bonning kept all of his valuables in a bricked-up basement, but all of his valuables, which included jewelry, antique candlesticks, a diamond-studded brooch, and silverware, were all stolen. The perpetrators were never caught. The final story for now is the quickest heist in the entire region. American paratroopers looted the municipal safe of Overasselt within 1 hour of landing. On the 17th of September 1944, around 2:05 in the afternoon, soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division jumped near Overasselt from their planes. One of them is Colonel Tucker and some other officers. After they landed, they went straight to the municipal building because they wanted to create their headquarters there. They arrived at 2:30. There, Colonel Tucker orders Albertus Diender, who was the sergeant of the military police, to open the door and unlock the safe. Now, Albertus didn't think much of it as they were our friends, our liberators. However, 2 days later he visited the municipal building and saw that the money box was taken out of the safe and opened. The funds that were in the box was the money from the municipality as well as money from the National Fund for Special Disasters, money from the local department for air protection and more. So, as you understand, the stories are endless. Now, was it only the Allied forces who looted? And were these soldiers allowed to loot? And what if they got caught? They weren't allowed to loot. The 1940s version of the Field Manual of the US Army states the rules of warfare. It essentially says that destroying belongings or looting can only be done if it was a military necessity, especially for historic monuments, hospitals, religious buildings, buildings home to charity, art, or science, and so on. In fact, if you as a US soldier would destroy belongings or plunder, you could at worst get the death penalty. But given the fact that many of the lootings were communicated by the Dutch Army Command to the US Army Command and government, that field manual clearly didn't mean anything and was written, for fun. Looting would obviously go hand in hand with the destruction, and that was done by intention. To be able to loot, you have to destroy things like doors and windows first, and to find everything you could, you destroy and open up floors, furniture, and so on. They would use explosives like dynamite, to blow up the safes. Generally speaking, it was mostly the Allies that looted. There were also some Dutch people who looted, and it happened quite a bit, and because of that, if you were caught, it would have been punished with the death penalty. But most looting was done by Allied forces. How do we know? Because it mostly happened in evacuated areas where no civilians were allowed to come. So what happened when people actually caught these soldiers red-handed? Generally speaking, they often gave a false name, which was actually advised by their superiors and commanders, or they made an excuse. And this made it very difficult to figure out who the perpetrators were. And besides that, people who had their items looted were also sometimes promised by them that the damage would be compensated later. So what now? 80 years after the liberation of the Netherlands, not much has happened, nor returned, with the exception of some. For instance, the son of a Canadian soldier named Broek Webber had 3 little bronze figurines that his dad stole when he was part of the liberation of Groningen in 1945. His dad had them for 80 years in Vancouver, and now his dad has passed and Broek wants to return the figurines to the rightful owner and is looking for the owner. There's also a story of an American soldier who gave his stolen antique coins to a Dutch tourist, who could then bring it back to the rightful owner in Groesbeek. Anonymous, as he was rightfully so very ashamed of his actions. But both of these stories are a very rare occasion. In Canada, 3 soldiers were sent to court for that at the end of 1945. They looted many items and then sold it, later exchanging the money for dollars. However, that was just 3 soldiers. It's nowhere near to close the number of soldiers who stole. Now we don't know exactly how many soldiers stole, but if we're looking at all the looted Dutch houses, we know it's not just a few. In the Netherlands, no one was ever prosecuted. You might wonder why, but it had a good reason. After the Netherlands was just liberated, the public prosecutions department wasn't exactly working. And by the time it started working, the soldiers were all gone. Yes, there were letters and complaints, but you cannot exactly start checking every single soldier that ever was here, that participated in the liberation. And you cannot check all of their goods endlessly, check all of the goods that go back and forth to the country and so on. It's impossible. Another thing was that these people were liberators, and it was deemed to be ungrateful to them, making this, especially at that time, a sensitive subject. Even so, researchers estimated a percentage of looted buildings in the evacuated region lays between 85 and 95%. No one knows how many soldiers participated in the looting, but American sources have a commander who admitted that at least 80% of his men had looted in Europe. The only reason it took so long for it to come to the forefront is because it was a sensitive subject and it wasn't the view of our heroes that we were supposed to have. But now 80 years later, it's definitely time. Yes, we're grateful to have been liberated from the Nazi occupation, but at the same time we can also be honest about the horrible things that the liberators did. Both things are important, and it's important to discuss the dark pages. Even after the liberation, the looting still continued, and it turned into spoils of war, where soldiers had the idea that they should be able to do whatever they wanted because they did it and the looting was their reward. So what do I think should happen? It would be great if more families would do the right thing, send these items back to where they belong. So if you know of any items that were taken from the Netherlands during the war, as a souvenir and those kind of things, then you now know what to do.